For 20 years, my father looked at my quiet, independent life and called me a failure. The climax of his cruelty happened at his own birthday party, where he raised a glass and publicly branded me a freeloader. He thought he held all the power. He thought I was just a quiet disappointment. But what he didn't know was that I possessed a security clearance higher than his CEO's, and in exactly 14 hours, I was going to walk into his corporate office and shut his entire department down. Welcome back. Today's story isn't just about a shocking healing family secret being exposed. It's about the deeply ingrained illusions of success, and what happens when a toxic patriarch is forced to formally salute the very daughter he spent a lifetime tearing down. This story will remind you that true power doesn't need to be loud, and your worth is never defined by someone who refuses to understand your journey. If you've ever had to protect your peace from the people who were supposed to protect you, please leave a like. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join our community of strong, authentic voices. Let's get into it. They say the deepest wounds do not come from your enemies. They come from the people who were supposed to protect you. I have spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to survive in hostile environments, navigating situations where a single miscalculation could mean the difference between life and death. Yet, nothing quite prepares you for the specific, suffocating tension of a suburban family barbecue. It was a crisp Sunday afternoon in early October. The air smelled of expensive charcoal and the kind of forced cheerfulness that only exists when people are trying very hard to impress one another. My father, Arthur Scott, stood in the center of our family's sprawling backyard, holding a crystal glass of bourbon like a scepter. He has always been a man who requires an audience, a man who measures human worth entirely by zip codes, the badge on the hood of a car, and the square footage of a home. To him, success is not something you feel. It is something you wear, something you display so others can feel appropriately inferior. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a paper cup of sparkling water, wearing a simple pair of denim jeans and a plain navy sweater. I have never felt the need to wear my resume on my sleeve. Beside the grill, my older brother David was holding court. David is the undisputed golden boy of the Scott family. He arrived in a brand new, leased Mercedes SUV, accompanied by his perfectly manicured wife and 2 children who looked like they had stepped out of a catalog. For years, Arthur had used David as the ultimate bludgeon against me, the shining example of what doing things the right way looked like. But if you pay close enough attention, the veneer of perfection always shows its cracks. Just 20 minutes earlier, I had watched David pace nervously behind the towering hydrangea bushes. I heard the strained, desperate pitch of his voice as he argued on his cell phone, aggressively whispering about a past due notice and begging for an extension on a massive line of credit. The golden boy was drowning in debt, buried under the crushing weight of trying to maintain an illusion he could no longer afford. I filed the information away, feeling a brief pang of pity. But I said nothing. The patio grew quiet as Arthur raised his glass, tapping it with a silver fork to command the attention of the 50-odd guests gathered on the lawn. He offered a toast, bragging about his latest quarterly bonus at Vanguard Defense Tech, and then, as he so often did, his eyes locked onto me. I could see the familiar glimmer of condescension settling over his features. He gestured toward me with his glass, a wide, theatrical smirk on his face. "And then there is Eleanor," he announced, his voice booming loud enough to echo off the neighbor's fence. 42 years old, still no husband to speak of, no mortgage that anyone knows about, and still happily living off a government handout job. A true freeloader, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose someone has to pay taxes so my daughter can keep playing hide-and-seek on the taxpayer's dime. A few polite, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I did not scream. I did not throw my drink. 18 years of military discipline teaches you how to hold your ground when under fire. But the silence that followed was broken by a voice I never expected to hear. My mother. Martha stepped out from the shadow of the awning. For 40 years, she had been the quiet, compliant wife, the woman who smoothed over Arthur's rough edges and swallowed her own pride to keep the peace. Not today. She walked directly up to Arthur, her posture rigid, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. "Arthur, that is enough," she said, her voice trembling but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Stop measuring your children by their bank accounts. Eleanor is independent. She is kind. And she is my daughter. If you cannot speak to her with respect in this house, then perhaps you shouldn't speak at all." The crowd froze. Arthur's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He opened his mouth to argue, but Martha held his gaze, refusing to back down. It was a quiet, magnificent display of female solidarity. A line drawn in the sand that shifted the entire power dynamic of our family in a matter of seconds. I offered my mother a silent, grateful nod. But before I could say a word, the encrypted government phone in my pocket began to vibrate against my hip. I stepped away from the stunned crowd and answered the secure line. It was my commanding officer. A massive, high-stakes compliance audit was launching the very next morning at Vanguard Defense Tech, the exact facility where Arthur managed operations. I had tried to recuse myself weeks ago due to the conflict of interest, but the orders were absolute. There had been a severe data and safety leak, and General Thomas Sterling, the CEO of Vanguard, had explicitly requested my unit. Duty called, superseding any family drama. I walked back to the patio, kissed my mother softly on the cheek, and told her I had an early morning. I drove back to my modest, quiet home, walking into my bedroom to open the closet. I reached past my civilian clothes and ran my fingers over the dark green fabric of my class address uniform. The silver eagle insignia of a full colonel gleamed in the dim light. Arthur had called me a freeloader. He had no idea that in less than 14 hours, I was going to shut his entire department down. The following morning felt different than any other deployment or assignment I had ever faced. There is a specific kind of gravity that settles into your bones when your professional duty collides directly with your personal history. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, meticulously adjusting the brass buttons of my Class A uniform. I pinned the silver eagles to my shoulders with practiced precision. This uniform was not merely a piece of clothing. It was the physical manifestation of 18 years of sacrifice, brutal training, and the heavy burden of commanding thousands of troops in zones where failure meant losing human lives. It was a testament to every time I was told a woman could not lead. And every time I proved them categorically wrong, I gathered my briefing folders, sliding the encrypted drive containing Vanguard's internal data logs into my leather briefcase. My mind was remarkably clear. I was not driving to Vanguard Defense Tech as a daughter seeking revenge. I was arriving as Colonel Eleanor Scott, an officer tasked with protecting the lives of the soldiers who relied on Vanguard's equipment. The arrival was anything but subtle. At precisely 800 hours, a convoy of 4 black government SUVs pulled into the circular driveway of Vanguard Defense Tech's gleaming corporate headquarters. The contrast between the sterile, profit-driven corporate environment and the austere, disciplined nature of a federal military audit was immediate. I stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by my team of military auditors and legal aides. As we walked through the revolving glass doors into the expansive marble lobby, the murmurs of the morning commute died down instantly. The corporate staff, clutching their coffees and briefcases, parted like the Red Sea. And there, standing near the security turnstiles with a look of supreme irritation on his face, was Arthur Scott. He was holding a clipboard, clearly dispatched by upper management to deal with what he likely assumed was a group of low-level, bureaucratic paper pushers. I watched his eyes scan the uniforms, the irritation slowly morphing into confusion. And then, as his gaze finally landed on my face, absolute, paralyzing horror. Before Arthur could even open his mouth to utter my name, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive elevator slid open. General Thomas Sterling, the CEO of Vanguard Defense Tech and a former 3-star military commander, strode briskly into the lobby. He was a man who commanded absolute authority in the corporate world, a man Arthur had spent a decade trying to impress. Sterling walked straight past his bewildered mid-level manager, stopped sharply 2 feet in front of me, and snapped to rigid, textbook attention, his hand raised in a crisp, deeply respectful salute. "Good morning, Colonel Scott." His voice boomed, echoing off the marble walls. "It is an honor to have you and your team here." I returned the salute with equal precision. "Good morning, General. We have a lot of ground to cover today." The silence in the lobby was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind that occurs when reality violently reorients itself. I did not smile. I did not look at Arthur with any trace of vindication. I simply turned my head, locking eyes with my father, Mr. Scott, I said, my voice cold, professional, and entirely devoid of familial warmth. "I require your departmental logs, your safety sign-offs, and your IP access records from the last 6 quarters. Have them in the main boardroom in 10 minutes. Once behind the closed doors of the executive boardroom, the true nature of Arthur's corporate survival tactics came to light. The room was tense, filled with Vanguard executives sweating under the scrutiny of my team. When I questioned the glaring gaps in the safety compliance records for a critical infantry communications system, Arthur immediately went on the defensive, without hesitation. He pointed his finger at a young, visibly terrified female junior analyst named Sarah, seated at the edge of the room. "The administrative failure lies with the junior staff, Colonel," Arthur stated, puffing up his chest in a desperate bid to save face. "Sarah was responsible for filing those final safety checks. I cannot be expected to babysit my subordinates." It was a classic display of toxic cowardice, sacrificing a young woman's career to protect his own ego and quarterly bonus. I did not raise my voice, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I opened my laptop and projected a series of documents onto the massive screen at the head of the table. "That is a fascinating narrative, Mr. Scott," I said evenly. "However, the digital evidence tells a very different story." On the screen, I displayed timestamped emails, encrypted IP access logs, and internal routing numbers. These logs confirm that Sarah did, in fact, submit the safety warnings regarding the component failures. Furthermore, these access logs prove that your specific administrative terminal overrode her flags, bypassed the secondary safety protocols, and forcibly pushed the equipment to manufacturing so your department could meet its deadline and secure its performance bonuses. Arthur went completely pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I looked directly at the young analyst, offering her a brief, reassuring nod, before turning my full, commanding presence back onto the man who had called me a freeloader the day before. "In my world, Mr. Scott, true leadership means protecting the people under your command, not sacrificing them for profit. Your department's operations are suspended immediately pending a full federal investigation." The immediate aftermath of the boardroom confrontation was a masterclass in the rapid disintegration of corporate arrogance. As the Vanguard executives scrambled to secure their remaining servers, and my team began cataloging the evidence of the safety bypasses, Arthur Scott seemed to physically shrink in his expensive tailored suit. He did not return to his desk. Instead, as I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway to make a secure call to the Pentagon liaison, I heard the hurried, desperate footsteps of my father approaching from behind. He pulled me into an empty, glass-walled conference room, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a toxic mixture of panic and residual entitlement. The man who had humiliated me in front of 50 people just 24 hours earlier was now looking at me not as a commanding officer, but attempting to leverage the very familial bond he had spent 2 decades treating with absolute disdain. "Ellie, listen to me," Arthur hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. He reached out as if to grab my arm, but my rigid posture stopped him dead in his tracks. "You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I have worked at this company for 12 years. I built this department. You have the authority here. You can amend the logs. You can flag it as a minor administrative oversight. Let me fix it internally, please. If this goes to a federal review, I lose everything. I looked at the man standing before me and felt an overwhelming sense of profound sorrow, not for his impending termination, but for the fundamental emptiness of his character. He was still trying to manipulate the system, completely oblivious to the gravity of his actions. I maintained eye contact, my voice dangerously calm and unwavering. "My name is Colonel Scott," I replied, the words landing like heavy stones between us. "And what you are asking me to do is commit federal treason to protect your quarterly bonus. Do you have any concept of what happens when an infantry communication system fails in a hostile combat zone? Soldiers die, Arthur. Men and women who trust us to ensure their equipment works bleed out in the dirt because someone like you decided a safety protocol was too expensive. My loyalty is to the sanctity of human life, not to the man who happens to share my DNA." Before Arthur could formulate another desperate excuse, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. General Thomas Sterling stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. His expression was a storm of barely contained fury, directed entirely at my father. Sterling had obviously heard enough of the conversation through the open door to understand exactly what Arthur was attempting to do. "Mr. Scott," the general said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, gravelly octave. "You stand in the presence of a woman whose integrity is absolute, and you attempt to corrupt her to save your own miserable skin. Let me tell you exactly why Colonel Scott is leading this audit, and why she commands the respect of every general in the armed forces." Sterling stepped closer, his eyes burning into Arthur's. 4 years ago, in the Korengal Valley, a unit was pinned down under heavy enemy fire. Their comms were jammed. They were bleeding out. Colonel Scott did not just sit behind a desk and push papers. Under the cover of darkness, risking her own career and life, she orchestrated an impossible medevac extraction that saved 12 men. One of those men was my youngest son. Your daughter values human life. It is something you clearly forgot how to do the moment you sat in a corporate chair. Pack your belongings, Mr. Scott. You are terminated, effective immediately. The destruction of my father's corporate illusion was only the first domino to fall that week. 2 days later, I drove to my parents' house to check on my mother, Martha, who had remained stoic and dignified throughout the ensuing scandal. But as I pulled my modest, high-mileage SUV onto their affluent, tree-lined street, I was met with a scene of absolute chaos playing out in the driveway. A heavy-duty tow truck was backing up toward the garage, its amber lights flashing against the manicured suburban lawns. Standing on the pavement, screaming into his cell phone with his face flushed purple, was my brother David, the undisputed golden boy. I parked at the curb and watched as the tow operator casually hooked the winch to the axle of David's gleaming, leased Mercedes SUV. David's perfectly manicured wife was standing on the porch, weeping openly into her hands. The golden boy's facade had shattered completely. The massive house, the luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, it was all built on a fragile, terrifying mountain of high-interest debt and fraudulent credit lines that had finally collapsed. As I watched the car being dragged away, the irony was almost suffocating. The son who had played the role of the ultimate success story was financially and morally bankrupt. The daughter who had been publicly branded a freeloader was the only one standing on solid, unshakable ground. It was a Tuesday evening when the knock came at my door. The storm of the previous week had finally settled, leaving a strange, quiet, heavy peace in its wake. Vanguard Defense Tech was undergoing a massive federal restructuring, and the Scott family's internal hierarchy had been irreversibly dismantled. I opened the front door of my modest, two-bedroom home to find my father standing on the porch. He was not wearing his tailored corporate armor. Instead, he wore a faded jacket, his shoulders slumped, his eyes carrying a profound, unfamiliar weight. He looked older, stripped of the manufactured arrogance that had defined his personality for my entire adult life. He expected me to slam the door. He expected me to gloat, to throw his public humiliation back in his face, to finally exact the vengeance he knew he deeply deserved. Instead, I stepped aside, gestured toward the living room, and quietly asked if he wanted a cup of coffee. The simple, ordinary act of grace seemed to break whatever fragile composure he had left. We sat at my small kitchen table, the silence stretching between us, thick with the ghosts of 20 years of unspoken resentments. Arthur stared down at his mug, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how to apologize for a lifetime of being completely blind," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "When I stood in that lobby and watched a 3-star general salute you, when I heard what you did for his son, I realized I didn't know you at all. I spent my whole life measuring people by what they could buy, by what they could show off to the neighbors. I grew up believing a man's only value was his paycheck. And then I looked at you, a woman who didn't need my money, didn't need a husband to validate her, didn't need to play my games. You were commanding armies, Ellie, and I was so deeply terrified and intimidated by your independence that I tried to make you feel small just so I could feel big. It was the most honest, agonizingly vulnerable thing my father had ever said." He was weeping now, the silent, heavy tears of a man mourning the decades he had wasted clinging to a toxic, fragile ego. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. I did not offer him toxic positivity or instant, unearned absolution. True healing requires honesty, and honesty requires boundaries. "I accept your apology, Dad," I said softly, but firmly. "But you do not get to erase 20 years of disrespect in a single night. You don't get to immediately step into the role of the proud father of a colonel. We have a lot of broken ground to cover, but we can start over today, not as a patriarch and a disappointment, but as equals. If you can respect the woman I actually am, rather than punishing me for the subservient girl I refuse to be, my door will remain open." Arthur nodded, gripping my hand like it was a lifeline. It was not a perfect Hollywood ending, but it was real. It was earned. He had lost his prestigious job, his unearned authority, and his arrogant worldview. But sitting in my quiet kitchen, stripped of all his worldly leverage, Arthur Scott had finally gained a daughter. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my family's story, it is this. Society spends so much time trying to convince women, especially as we mature and step into our own power, that our value is strictly tied to what we can display to the world. A ring on our finger, the square footage of our home, the aesthetic perfection of our children. We are taught to shrink ourselves, to silence our accomplishments, to make the men around us feel taller and more secure. My father looked at my quiet, private life and saw failure, because he was blinded by a toxic definition of success. But true success does not need a billboard. True success is integrity. It is doing the right thing when it is terrifying, even when the person sitting across the boardroom table is your own father. It is about equality, demanding the exact same standard of accountability for everyone, regardless of their gender, their age, or their position of power. We must stop measuring human worth by material accumulation and start measuring it by human compassion and moral courage. I did not shut down my father's department out of petty vengeance. I did it because the lives of the soldiers relying on that equipment mattered more than keeping a toxic family secret. True power isn't about crushing the people who hurt you. It is about having the strength to protect the vulnerable, and the grace to leave the door open for those who have wronged you to finally learn how to respect you. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the black sheep of your family simply because you chose to live authentically and refuse to conform, I want you to hit that like button right now. Leave a comment below and tell me, how did you define your own success when everyone else doubted you? I read every single comment, and your stories give me life. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. But before you go, a quick warning. Do not use my story as an excuse to go to war with your family. Boundaries are necessary, but cruelty is never the answer. Stand in your truth, hold your ground, but never lose your empathy. Let them be wrong about you, while you continue to do what is right. Stay strong, Stay graceful, and I will see you in the next video. The passage of time has a peculiar way of smoothing out the jagged edges of a crisis, leaving behind a landscape that is forever altered but somehow newly habitable. By the time November arrived, bringing with it the sharp, biting winds of early winter, the Scott family dynamic had shifted so profoundly that it was almost unrecognizable. The grand, sprawling suburban house that my parents shared no longer felt like a museum curated for the sole purpose of intimidating the neighbors. Without the constant influx of Arthur's corporate salary and the heavy, suffocating weight of his executive ego, the house had grown quieter, softer, and infinitely more human. Arthur had spent the first few weeks of his forced retirement in a state of quiet shock, wandering the empty rooms like a man who had suddenly forgotten the language of his own life. But slowly, the absence of his title began to carve out space for something else. I would occasionally drive by on a Sunday morning and see him in the driveway, not polishing a luxury sedan to show off to the street, but wearing a pair of faded denim overalls, meticulously clearing the gutters or quietly sweeping the porch. He was learning, piece by piece, how to exist in the world without a business card to announce his worth. However, the most magnificent transformation belonged entirely to my mother. For 4 decades, Martha Scott had been the quintessential invisible woman, the dutiful corporate wife who shrank herself so her husband could cast a larger shadow. She had spent her entire adult life managing Arthur's moods, cooking meals meant to impress his colleagues, and biting her tongue until it bled. But the afternoon she stood up to him in front of 50 people had been a catalyst. It was as if a dam had broken inside her, releasing decades of stifled agency. When I visited them the week before Thanksgiving, I found her sitting at the kitchen island, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers. She was restructuring their budget, taking absolute control of the household finances with a sharp, uncompromising competence that Arthur had never bothered to acknowledge. When Arthur walked into the kitchen and sheepishly asked if she needed help, Martha did not jump up to serve him. She simply looked at him over the rim of her glasses and calmly asked him to start peeling the potatoes. It was a small, seemingly insignificant interaction, but watching my father quietly nod and turn toward the sink was a testament to a complete revolution. Equality had finally breached the walls of their marriage. Martha had insisted on hosting a Thanksgiving dinner, but she made it explicitly clear that it would not be the chaotic, performative spectacle of years past. There were no embossed invitations, no catered appetizers, and absolutely no neighbors invited to marvel at their supposed perfection. It was to be only the 4 of us: Martha, Arthur, David, and myself. When I pulled into the driveway on Thursday afternoon, I parked next to a battered, 10-year-old sedan that I barely recognized. It belonged to David. The lease on his gleaming Mercedes had been terminated, and the bank had finalized the foreclosure on his sprawling, unmanageable estate. He and his wife were currently renting a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town, attempting to salvage what was left of their marriage now that the intoxicating illusion of endless wealth had evaporated. I walked up the front steps carrying a simple homemade pie. Wearing comfortable slacks and a warm wool sweater, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. For the first time in my 42 years of existence, I was not bracing myself for an ambush. I was not walking into a battlefield disguised as a dining room. I was simply walking into a home. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the rich, comforting aromas of roasted turkey and sage. But it was also heavy with an unspoken, fragile vulnerability. I found my mother in the kitchen, carefully basting the bird. She looked up at me, her eyes crinkling with a genuine, unburdened smile. I set the pie down on the counter and wrapped my arms around her. We stood there for a long moment. 2 women who had navigated entirely different wars, but had both somehow survived to find their own power. "You look beautiful, Mom," I whispered. And I meant it. She looked remarkably younger. The chronic tension finally drained from her jaw and shoulders. She pulled back slightly, smoothing her hands over her apron, her gaze turning serious and intensely deeply focused. I spent my whole life thinking that being a good woman meant making myself as small and agreeable as possible, she said, her voice steady and resolute. I watched you build this incredible, courageous life, and for years, I let your father convince me that you were the one doing it wrong. I am so deeply sorry, Eleanor. I was too afraid to defend you because I didn't know how to defend myself. I held her hands, feeling the rough texture of a lifetime of quiet labor, and told her that bravery does not have an expiration date. She had found her voice exactly when she was meant to, and in doing so, she had broken a generational curse that would never again haunt the women in our family. Dinner was a revelation in its utter lack of pretense. There was no fun china, no crystal goblets, and no desperate attempts to steer the conversation toward promotions, acquisitions, or social status. We sat around the scarred wooden kitchen table, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans, eating off everyday ceramic plates. The silence that occasionally settled over the table was no longer weaponized. It was merely the quiet, contemplative space of four people trying to figure out how to be honest with one another for the very first time. David sat across from me, his shoulders hunched, staring down at his plate. The golden boy looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes a stark contrast to his formerly flawless, manicured appearance. Halfway through the meal, Arthur set his fork down and looked directly at his son. David, Arthur began, his voice rough with unshed emotion. I owe you an apology. For your entire life, I made you believe that my love was conditional upon your success. I pushed you to build a life that looked perfect from the outside, regardless of what it was costing you on the inside. I handed you a blueprint for a prison, and I smiled while you locked yourself inside. I'm so sorry. The impact of those words was immediate and devastating. David's lower lip trembled. And then, completely abandoning whatever shreds of pride he was still clutching, he buried his face in his hands and wept. It was a visceral, ugly, beautiful release of 20 years of suffocating pressure. He cried for the debt, for the sleepless nights, for the sheer terror of trying to maintain an illusion that was slowly killing him. Nobody told him to stop. Nobody told him to man up or pull himself together. Arthur reached across the table and placed a firm, grounding hand on David's shoulder, while Martha quietly passed him a linen napkin. I watched my brother unravel, and I realized in that moment that the true tragedy of the patriarchy is not just what it demands of women, but the impossible, soul-crushing armor it forces men to wear. David had never been the enemy. He had been a hostage to the same toxic metric of success that had labeled me a freeloader. When his tears finally slowed, he looked over at me, his eyes red and remarkably clear. I don't even know who I am without all the expensive garbage. Ellie, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to start over. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, offering him the same absolute, unwavering focus I would give a soldier under my command. You start by telling the truth, David, I said gently. You start by realizing that losing your fake life is the greatest gift you could have ever received. You are no longer chained to a car payment or a mortgage that was designed to impress people who do not actually care about you. You get to wake up tomorrow and decide what actually matters. I did not offer to pay his debts or fix his problems, because true respect means allowing someone the dignity of fighting their own battles. Instead, I offered him my guidance, my presence, and my unwavering belief in his capacity to rebuild. I told him about the men and women I had served alongside people who had absolutely nothing in terms of material wealth, but possessed a richness of character and an unbreakable loyalty that money could never fabricate. I told him that true value is forged in the fire of accountability, and that he was, finally, blessedly free to discover what his soul was actually made of. As the evening drew to a close and I drove back to my quiet, empty house under a canopy of brilliant winter stars, I felt a profound sense of closure settle deep within my chest. I thought about the military uniform hanging neatly in my closet, the silver eagles resting on the shoulders. I had spent 18 years serving my country, standing on foreign soil, enforcing safety, and demanding integrity in the most hostile environments on Earth. But the hardest, most vital mission of my life had not taken place in a war zone. It had taken place in a suburban backyard and a corporate boardroom. I had fought to protect the vulnerable, but I had also fought for the fundamental right to exist exactly as I am, without apology, without shrinking, and without needing permission from a society that prefers women to remain decorative and quiet. To any woman navigating her 40s, 50s, or beyond, who has ever been made to feel like a disappointment simply because she refused to live by someone else's script, your life belongs to you. Do not let anyone reduce your worth to a bullet point on a resume or a tag on a driveway. Stand in your truth. Hold your ground. And remember that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to play the game. The aftermath of a catastrophic structural collapse, whether in a towering corporate hierarchy or within the delicate, invisible bonds of a family, is rarely loud. The explosive moments of a confrontation are always followed by a long, grueling silence where the actual, unglamorous work of rebuilding must begin. In the weeks following the Vanguard Defense Tech audit and my father's subsequent termination, the federal investigation expanded. I found myself returning to that gleaming glass and steel building, not as a harbinger of sudden ruin, but as an architect of systemic reform. The atmosphere in the corporate lobbies and executive boardrooms had fundamentally shifted. The palpable, toxic arrogance that once saturated the air had been vacuumed out, replaced by a nervous, hyper-vigilant dedication to protocol. Men who had previously coasted on their titles and country club affiliations were suddenly forced to justify their positions through actual, measurable competence. It was a rigorous, exhausting process, but it was exactly the kind of structural reckoning that prioritizing human life requires. During one of my final site visits to Vanguard, I made a point to seek out Sarah, the young junior data analyst my father had so callously attempted to sacrifice to save his own career. I found her in a small, windowless office on the third floor, buried under stacks of compliance manuals. When I walked in, wearing my Class A uniform, she immediately jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with a residual, ingrained panic. I gently instructed her to sit down and took a seat across from her desk. Folding my hands over my briefing folder, I looked at this brilliant, terrified young woman and saw so many echoes of my own early career. The crushing pressure to be perfect, the constant fear of overstepping, the exhausting reality of navigating spaces heavily dominated by men who view female competence as a direct threat. You saved lives, Sarah, I told her, making sure my voice carried the absolute, unshakable weight of my rank. Your diligent documentation and your refusal to permanently delete those safety warnings, even when a senior manager ordered you to, ensured that defective communication arrays never reached an active combat zone. You did not fail. The leadership above you failed. Sarah stared at me, her eyes welling with tears as the immense, crushing anxiety of the past 2 months finally began to evaporate. Mr. Scott told me that if I pushed back, I would never work in this industry again, she whispered, her voice trembling from the memory of the intimidation. He told me I was too young to understand how the real world operated. I leaned forward, holding her gaze with a fierce, protective intensity. The real world operates exactly how we allow it to operate, I replied. Do not ever let an incompetent man convince you that your integrity is a liability simply because it exposes his cowardice. You take up space in this industry. Sarah, you demand respect. And you never, ever apologize for doing the right thing. It was a conversation about fundamental human rights and basic equality in the workplace, emphasizing that courage is not defined by a title, but by the willingness to stand firm when standing firm is the hardest thing to do. Before I left Vanguard that afternoon, General Thomas Sterling pulled me aside to inform me that Sarah had been promoted to lead the new Internal Safety Oversight Committee. The old guard was effectively dismantled, making way for a generation that actually understood the value of human life. As I drove away from the Vanguard facility for the last time, I felt a profound sense of closure. The systemic rot had been excised. But more importantly, the deeply ingrained patriarchal belief that power equates to immunity had been shattered. I thought about Arthur, sitting in his quiet suburban home, stripped of the corporate armor that had allowed him to inflict so much collateral damage on the people around him. There is a deeply educational, universal lesson in the rapid descent of a man who builds his entire identity on superiority and intimidation. Gravity always wins. When your entire worth is tethered to a manufactured hierarchy, you are completely empty the moment that hierarchy is removed. I had spent 18 years serving my country, but I realized that true service is not just about defending borders. It is about defending human dignity. It is about ensuring that the vulnerable are not crushed by the arrogant. Driving down the interstate, the winter sun setting in a brilliant blaze of orange and gold, I felt the heavy mantle of the past 20 years finally lift from my shoulders. The freeloader had successfully rewired the system, and she had done it without ever compromising her soul. Spring arrived not with a sudden, dramatic burst, but with a slow, deliberate thawing of the frozen earth. It was a fitting metaphor for the quiet, steady progress happening within the Scott family. 6 months had passed since the explosive barbecue and the catastrophic Vanguard audit, and the landscape of our lives had been entirely rewritten. David, the former golden boy, had fully embraced his financial ruin and emerged on the other side remarkably lighter. He and his wife had moved into a modest, 3-bedroom rental in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. Stripped of his grueling corporate schedule and the crushing anxiety of his fraudulent debts, David had taken a job managing logistics for a local nonprofit organization. He was earning a fraction of his former salary, but for the first time in his adult life, he was home in time to eat dinner with his children. When I visited him in late April, I found him in his small backyard, wearing stained jeans and planting tomatoes with his daughter. There was no leased Mercedes in the driveway, no country club polo on his back, but his laughter was deep, genuine, and entirely free. He had finally discovered that a successful life is measured by the peace in your heart, not the price tag on your existence. The most striking evolution, however, continued to unfold between my parents. Arthur had not miraculously transformed into a perfect, enlightened man human beings rarely do, but he had become a profoundly humbled one. He spent his days volunteering at a local veterans center, using his remaining administrative skills to help returning soldiers navigate their benefits paperwork. He was no longer a powerful executive barking orders. He was simply Arthur, a man learning how to be of actual service to the world. Martha, meanwhile, had blossomed. She had joined a community board, started a small garden club, and most importantly, she no longer asked for permission to speak. When the 4 of us gathered for a simple Sunday lunch at my parents' house, the air was entirely devoid of the toxic comparisons and arrogant monologues that had defined our family for decades. We were just 4 flawed, healing human beings, sitting around a table, practicing the radical art of mutual respect. Arthur looked at me across the table, not with the sneering condescension of the past, but with a quiet, steady pride that required no words at all. We had survived the collapse of our dysfunctional foundation, and we were slowly, carefully building something real in its place. If you are watching this, and you find yourself trapped in a family dynamic or a corporate environment that constantly demands you shrink yourself to survive, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not owe your parents, your siblings, or your boss the sacrifice of your own dignity just to keep a toxic peace. For 20 years, I was the designated disappointment because I refused to measure my life by the shallow, materialistic metrics of a patriarchal system. I chose a life of service, of discipline, and of deep, quiet integrity. It was lonely, and it was hard, but it was mine. Do not wait for the people who hurt you to suddenly wake up and validate your choices. Validate yourself. Demand equality. Enforce your boundaries. And never allow a person who measures success by a zip code to dictate the value of your soul. Your worth is inherent. It is not something you have to earn by performing the correct version of womanhood for the benefit of insecure men. We share stories like this because healing in isolation is nearly impossible. When we speak our truth, we give other women the permission to speak theirs. So, if Eleanor's journey resonated with you today, if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic table or burn down a broken system to protect your own peace, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your story. How did you reclaim your power? Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our ongoing journey. But remember this crucial warning before you go. Setting boundaries is an act of self-love, not a weapon of war. Do not seek revenge against those who misunderstood you. Seek an elevation they cannot reach. Let your integrity be your loudest response. And let your peace be your ultimate victory. Stay strong, stay grounded, and I will see you in the next video. The true measure of profound personal transformation is never found in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, when the shock of the fall is still fresh and humility is simply a survival mechanism. True transformation is tested in the quiet, unremarkable moments that follow, and sometimes it is tested when the ghosts of your past unexpectedly walk back into the room. It had been exactly 1 year since the infamous backyard barbecue that fractured the foundation of the Scott family. October had arrived once more, bringing with it the familiar chill and the turning of the leaves. But this time, there were no forced suburban gatherings designed to display our supposed superiority. Instead, my mother, Martha, was hosting a charity fundraising gala for the community board she now fiercely directed. The event was held in the modest, warmly lit gymnasium of a local community center, aimed at raising funds for a women's domestic shelter. It was an event born of genuine compassion rather than corporate posturing. But because of the affluent nature of the surrounding suburbs, a few figures from Vanguard Defense Tech had managed to make an appearance. I stood near the refreshment table, dressed in a simple but elegant black evening gown, watching the room with the ingrained, hyper-vigilant observation of a commanding officer. I saw my father, Arthur, near the back entrance. He was not wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, nor was he holding a glass of spritz to command the room's attention. He wore a standard, off-the-rack dark suit, and he was quietly helping a group of volunteers fold and stack folding chairs as the main presentation concluded. There was a quiet dignity in his posture, a lack of the frantic, desperate need to be noticed that had plagued him for decades. As I watched him, I noticed a man approaching him, Howard, a former vice president from Vanguard, a man who had once been one of Arthur's closest corporate allies and fiercest rivals. Howard was holding a crystal tumbler, his chest puffed out with the familiar, suffocating arrogance that I had spent 18 years actively fighting against. He looked Arthur up and down, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "Arthur Scott," Howard drawled, his voice loud enough to carry over the quiet murmur of the crowd. "I heard you were spending your retirement setting up chairs in high school gymnasiums. Quite a step down from the executive floor, wouldn't you say? It's a shame how things ended for you at Vanguard. We could have used your ruthless touch this quarter." I felt a sudden, protective surge of adrenaline spike in my chest. For a fleeting second, I considered crossing the room to intercept the conversation, to shield my father from the humiliation of his past. But I stopped myself. If Arthur's growth was real, he had to defend it himself. I watched as Arthur finished folding a metal chair, placing it neatly against the wall. He turned to face his former colleague, and there was no shame in his eyes. There was no defensive posturing, no desperate attempt to rewrite history. "It's good to see you, Howard," Arthur said, his voice calm, steady, and entirely free of malice. "But you're wrong. I didn't take a step down. For the first time in my life, I actually took a step up." Howard's smirk faltered, clearly confused by the lack of a combative response. Arthur gestured toward the room. toward Martha, who was confidently speaking to a group of donors. And then his eyes found mine across the distance. I spent 12 years at Vanguard measuring my worth by the fear I could instill in my subordinates and the size of my bonus. I was a remarkably small man wearing a very expensive suit. I lost my job because I forgot how to value human life. And losing that job was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Arthur offered Howard a polite, dismissive nod. I am exactly where I need to be. Howard, I am helping my wife. I am present for my son, and I am finally trying to be the kind of man my daughter always deserved. Enjoy your evening. Howard stood there, utterly disarmed by a level of vulnerability and truth he simply could not weaponize. Arthur turned his back on the vice president and went back to stacking chairs. In that quiet, unassuming moment, my father had exhibited more genuine strength than he ever had in a corporate boardroom. The change was not an act. The arrogant patriarch was gone, and a good, honorable man had finally taken his place. The morning after the charity gala, I sat on the back porch of my quiet, two-bedroom home, nursing a cup of black coffee and watching the morning mist burn off the lawn. The air was crisp, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of impending winter. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and watched as Arthur's practical, unassuming sedan pulled into my driveway. He walked around to the back of the house, holding a small, velvet-covered box in his hands. He looked tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the exhaustion of a man who had slept deeply and honestly. He climbed the wooden steps, took a seat in the Adirondack chair beside me, and placed the small box on the table between us. For a long moment, we simply sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind move through the heavy branches of the oak trees. There was no longer a need to fill the quiet spaces with justifications or performative dialogue. I wanted to give you something, Arthur finally said, his voice soft but carrying a profound weight. I have spent the last year trying to figure out how to properly honor the woman you are, without making it about my ego. I realized that keeping the artifacts of my old life was only anchoring me to a man I no longer want to be. He nudged the velvet box toward me. I opened it slowly. Inside was a piece of heavy, official-looking paper. It was a receipt of donation from a highly respected national foundation that provides full collegiate scholarships for young women entering the fields of public service, law, and military leadership. The donation was substantial, large enough to fully fund a young woman's education for 4 years. I looked at the name at the bottom of the receipt. It was funded entirely by the sale of Arthur's vintage, gold Rolex watch. The very same watch he had relentlessly tapped against the podium at Vanguard. The ultimate symbol of his corporate vanity had been liquidated to pave the way for a new generation of female leaders. The scholarship was officially registered under the name the Colonel Eleanor Scott Grant for Integrity and Leadership. I looked up at my father, the breath catching in my throat. My eyes burned with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. Dad, I whispered the word, feeling completely different on my tongue than it had a year ago. It was no longer a title of obligation. It was a term of deep, abiding endearment. You didn't have to do this. Arthur smiled, a gentle, weathered expression that reached all the way to his eyes. Yes, I did, Ellie, he replied. For 20 years. I tried to teach you how to survive in a world built by men. I didn't realize you were already busy building a better world entirely. I want my legacy to be the support of women, just like you women, who refuse to compromise their souls for the comfort of the establishment. You showed me what true honor looks like. This is my salute to you. He reached over and squeezed my hand, firm, grounding pressure that spoke volumes of respect and absolute equality. We sat together as the sun fully crested the horizon, the warmth finally touching the cold wooden deck. Two soldiers who had fought entirely different wars and had both finally found our way home. If there is a final truth I can leave you with, it is this. Your value is not a negotiation. As women, we are often told that aging makes us invisible, that our worth depreciates the moment we stop conforming to the expectations of a society obsessed with youth and subservience. But let me tell you from the bottom of my heart, your power only deepens with time. every battle you have fought, every toxic environment you have walked away from, every time you refused to be called a disappointment simply because you were standing in your truth. It has forged you into a force of nature. Do not let anyone, not your family, not your employer, and certainly not the ghosts of your past, convince you that you are anything less than magnificent. You do not need to be a colonel to command respect, but you must demand it. Set your boundaries. Protect your peace. And never be afraid to let a broken system burn to the ground, so you can build something beautiful from the ashes. Thank you for walking through this incredible journey with me. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and subscribe to our community. Keep your head high, your heart open, and your integrity absolute. I will see you in the next video. As we close the book on Eleanor's journey today, I want to leave you with a thought that I hope settles deep into your heart. We live in a world that constantly asks women to justify their existence through the lens of what they can display. We are taught that if we aren't showing off the traditional markers of success, the perfect marriage, the massive house, the subservient smile, then we are somehow falling behind. But Eleanor's story shatters that illusion entirely. Her father, Arthur, was trapped in a prison of his own making, a prison built on ego, titles, and a toxic, outdated definition of worth. He confused a paycheck with a personality, and authority with respect. But true respect cannot be bought, and it certainly cannot be demanded by belittling the people around you. It is earned through absolute integrity. Eleanor didn't need to scream or throw a tantrum when she was publicly humiliated. She let her actions, her character, and her unshakable truth do the talking. When she finally confronted her father, she didn't crush him out of petty spite. She held him accountable. That is the highest form of self-respect. For any woman listening to this who has ever been made to feel small by a family member, a partner, or a boss, remember that their inability to see your value does not decrease your worth. You do not need their applause to know you are standing on solid ground. Keep building your life quietly, steadily, and fiercely. Let them underestimate you. Because when the truth finally comes to light, your integrity will be the only armor you ever needed. This content was meticulously researched, built, and manually edited by our team to bring you genuine meaning and valuable life lessons.